the recording is focusing on Ms. Gavilanes. But if anyone does not want themselves to be recorded, even accidentally, then step outside the range of the camera, that's all. I don't think it's a big deal, but, okay? You might be in the camera if you interact. Now, that went up there. Let's see when we get enough contrast for you. If I close this, how's that? And leave just the backlight on?
Yeah, that's fine.
Good for you? Okay, fire away.
Hello, everybody. My name is Talia. I am a senior at this college, as Professor Perrin had said. I've been studying women of ancient Egypt in particular for the last couple of months, almost a whole year. And I wouldn't consider myself an expert just yet, but I've touched the surface of things that I would love to share with you guys today. So I've prepared a wonderful PowerPoint here, and it goes through the whole expansion of Egypt. Here is a timeline starting specifically at the beginning all the way to the Ptolemaic. That's where the famous Cleopatra's at. What I like about this timeline is the fact that it has the women in particular. Most timelines specifically focus on the men, and we know a lot about King Tut and Tutankhamun and all of them, but do we know about the women that stood behind them? Oftentimes we look at our mothers and we're like, oh my God, she's a strong woman. But do we ever personalize that to ancient times? And I don't think we do enough. So for that, I would like to take you on this journey. First, we'll start with Mernith. I'll go in between each of them really quickly. Mernith started at the beginning. So what Egypt was famous for was their regency. We've all heard about regencies. There's like a movie called Regency. So basically, just to give a recap on that, it's when the son or anybody who's taking the throne couldn't necessarily take the throne at the time before coronation. They were too young. The mother or somebody would step in. Now, what made this dangerous is the fact that there were so many children. The pharaoh would go and he would have a surplus of children because only 1 out of 2 every 3 children would actually make it to adulthood. So he needed to visit these places called harems. Now, Mernith here, she knew the threat to perfection. She had 1 son. He was about 5 years old, and the husband, which was also her brother, which was also the uncle of the child, long connection, had a bunch of sons, and they were a little bit older than her son, so she needed to kill them. How do you plan on killing them? How do you get away with murder, basically, right? So what she did is they did sacrifices. I say sacrifices in quotation marks is because she killed about 2,000 people that was in the court, the favorite concubines, the favorite children, and the favorite men of her husband/brother, because she needed to eliminate all competition that could have possibly arose for her son. After that, we have a couple other regencies in between, such as Nefertiti and Nefertari, and I'll be touching upon them later in the PowerPoint. But it's just to remember that the stronger that these women were, they were highlighted for the wrongdoings and not necessarily highlighted for the things that they did for the government. After that, we have Nefersobrak and Hatshepsut. Hatshepsut actually reached the title of king. As a woman, the title king was extraordinary, but she did so while keeping her femininity. How is that? From her waist, from her neck up, she dressed as a man with the headdress of a king, of a pharaoh, even with wigs to make it look like she had a beard or extra body hair. But from the neck below, she bared her breasts and wore anything a queen would wear because she wanted to make sure people knew, although she was a woman, she was still the king. After that, we hit New Kingdom, and it declines a little bit with the impact that the queens and regents do, but then we end with Cleopatra. Now, does anybody know a famous fact of Cleopatra?
We haven't gotten to Cleopatra yet. When we do Rome, as we go along, we will get to her. But you may have, from your other teachers or from high school, have picked up something. So.
Anybody?
She doesn't actually come from Egypt.
Anybody else? Okay. Most facts that people know about Cleopatra is very sexualized. They tend to go away from the idea that she did so much more for the economy, especially keeping Egypt independent and not collaborating with Greek and Rome as her siblings wanted to. And for that, she had to kill them off. But we don't know that. We just know that she was the mistress for Mark Antony, and she liked to sleep with people, right? Okay. Now, geography is extremely important to remember when going through this because everything that Egypt did was directly affected by Greece and Rome due to the body of water that they shared and the Nile River. So, some facts about the Nile River. At the time, the Egyptians did not explore the vast quantity of water that it did have. So, for them, only 1,000 miles was what they thought the Nile River was. We know today it's much longer than that. Also, it falls from south to north, which is opposite from water down over here or in any other part of the world. It goes opposite. What made the Egyptians thrive and such inclement weather was the fact that the Nile River receded during certain amount of years. So they would have the winter period where the water would recede, and that's when they did a lot of their construction and a lot of their building. They also took that time for agriculture, and they used the sit, or like the heavy dirt that was fertilized by the water, to do a lot of their farming. And for that, that's why they had a lot of riches for food. There was a lot of settlers towards the body of water. Now, what's interesting is you would think that the poorer the people are would be the people who would farm and the people closer to the water, when in reality, it was a combination of both lower middle and upper class that lived by the Nile River. Some of them loved the view and enjoyed the luxury of washing themselves daily, and others needed it specifically for farming. But another fun fact, most farmers were women and they owned their own land, which isn't common in other places in the world. So these are some notes I would recommend taking because it specifically goes over the deities and gods and goddesses that they had. What makes this different from other mythologies is that they used animal heads. If you do Greek and Roman mythology, they don't tend to put animals in direct correlation with their gods and goddesses. It's usually an animal mating with the god and goddesses, which give us a combination of demigods or half this and half that, and they end up always being evil. But in ancient cultures for Egypt, having an animal head was actually a figure and symbol of respect and honor. And not all of them are real people. Some of them are based loosely off of real people, while others, such as Isis and Osiris, were based on what they believed. Now, talking about Isis and Osiris. This is what ancient Egyptians practiced. It was a belief in many gods. We see this practice often in the Middle East and in Asia and sometimes in Africa, but not so much in Western cultures because we have tended to wash down the idea of multiple gods, and we have only decided to keep it into one god, and they did not have that. Their gods and goddesses were androgynous, which meant that it did not matter if they were male or female. They could have cross-dressed, wore makeup, and married whoever they decided to marry. The story of Isis and Osiris interested me the most because they were brothers and sister who decided to marry each other. But there was one more sibling. He was not a good guy. His name was Set, and oftentimes he's depicted as a goat or a pig's head, and he's typically not seen as a good guy because he did in fact kill his brother, according to mythology. Then Isis, who's the giver of life in their eyes, decided to put him back together, and then they had a child. Horus was the child's name, and he decided to, bring his father back from the underworld and gave him a second chance of life. And then from there, Horus stayed predominantly in the underworld, visiting for some time in the above ground and sometimes stayed below ground. But their family dynamic set a very strong path for how the Egyptian royals kept their lineage as well. The afterlife was extremely important to them because the Egyptians believed that the afterlife was not a dead part of just being dead. If you died, they thought that there was going to be another life. Specifically, if you were a woman. If you were a woman in ancient Egypt, they thought that was the first form of a soul. So when then they buried you once more, they would put red more on the sarcophagus, meaning that it would help you become, instead of a butterfly, you would become a man in the next life, which is, I don't think is the same positive views, but if you want to become a man in the next life, that's definitely up to you. The pyramids were what they kept their tombs in, and it was piled with riches and gold and the favorite concubines and anything that the king or anybody of royal was able to afford and wanted in his life and afterlife he would keep also in his tomb. So this leads me to ask you guys, how would you want to be buried? Because from the beginning of Regency in ancient Egypt, they had to start financially planning and planning with their court exactly how they wanted to be buried. But in modern day, specifically with the pandemic, we don't necessarily talk about it. And oftentimes we think it's a taboo topic because how dare you ask somebody how they want to die? But in this culture, they wanted to know exactly how you wanted to die so they could give you the best afterlife. For me, I want to be preserved naturally because I don't think that being buried is a big thing and, you just go with the flow type of thing. Does anybody else want to share how they want to be buried?
I'll share if you want. I want to be cremated, and I want my wife to mix my ashes with the ashes of my favorite pet. So we can go to eternity together.
See, that's a wonderful idea. They also believed sharing their afterlife with their favorite things, and oftentimes people get buried by themselves. Anybody else?
I was thinking the same thing, but like I know like some people have like rockets and stuff like that. I was gonna like think like do something like that.
Very interesting. Anybody
Somebody
else?
else. Let's see what other people think.
Like in the ground.
Regular
you know,
burial?
Regularly, But I haven't really thought about it that much. I don't think most people do, at this age at least.
I think I also want to. Sorry, I didn't do that. But I think I want to have like a normal funeral too. Like you can like see my wife before I die, and then you made it and then do like lock it.
You also had your hand up?
I think I'd like to be buried in, underground in a cemetery, probably in a lot, like around all my loved ones and stuff. That way I can live with them forever, and then people can come visit us all too.
So, with that, would you guys ever consider bringing your loved ones with you into the afterlife? Have you ever thought about that?
What do you mean?
So, the ancient Egyptians, if you had 5 wives, but wife number 3 and 4 was your absolute favorite, and you were like, I want her also with me in the afterlife, no way, Jose, is she going to be with somebody else? They'd sacrifice her over your tomb, mummify her, and then you would technically be buried together, which meant that your souls together would be in the afterlife. Would you ever consider having your mother follow you into the afterlife, your brothers, your sisters?
No.
I love them like that. But that's kind of awkward. I
I feel like it would be self-centered.
yeah, I want her to have her own separate life in the afterlife as well, but like I still want to be with her at the same time too. So it's kind of like a yes and no.
Understandable. See, they did not think that. They thought that they wanted absolutely everything. Even if you had a party next week and the king ended up dying the week before, party's not happening. Was not gonna happen. The pyramids weren't exactly what we see today. They didn't look the same. They were white with a gold top. Now the gold top is obviously gone because if you're walking in Egypt, it's a great vast desert. I don't think you're gonna leave a chunk of gold just sitting there. Anybody and everybody's gonna figure out a way to get to the top of that pyramid for that chunk of gold. Because nobody's gonna question you. You're just like, I found gold. It is what it is. They adorned the walls with protection symbols. So as we see in this image here, we have images of the deities. The hawk and the eye are the symbol of protection in the afterlife. This is the symbol also of the son of Isis and Osiris. They were meant to be mazes, although we know now they did not work because they're practically empty. But they were meant to be mazes so that tomb raiders couldn't get to the gold and couldn't invade them and, take everything that you worked so hard your whole life to accumulate. What is also very interesting is at the pinnacle of maybe, let's say, when Europe started to travel and they discovered the pyramids as well, and they realized that they could also get to the gold. They would also take the mummies and take them back to Europe. And what do you think they did with them? Do you think they put them on display, or do you think they ate them? Well, they ate them. They ate the mummies as a type of jerky because they saw it to be a sort of luxury. Because haven't you ever thought throughout all those years, thousands of years in families of people being mummified, where are all the mummies? Haven't you ever thought about that? Well, they're eaten by Europeans. It's not a good story, but if you could afford it, you could have it at your next birthday party. It was very dark also. So you have to think that there's no windows, there's no lighting, no ventilation. They had to come up with the light bulb. Their light bulbs were so intricate that we can't even replicate how to make a light bulb properly work today. But this is what we were able to find, and then these were the hieroglyphics of those light bulbs being used in practice. Many people assimilate them with aliens, but I truly just think that they had a better idea of something that we didn't do today. Also here with the columns for support and more images. Mummification. So here I have, it is just a souvenir, but it shows how every single part of the mummy were to be decorated. Now, in the museums, if you go and you see a mummy that's been preserved there, you can also see that they have no section of the mummy left unmarked because they did not want one section of your dead body to be invaded by evil. If you'd like, we can pass this around and everybody can see this as well. Of course, it's not an exact replica, but it's better than just imagining it with your mind. These would look like the sacrificial swords that they would use to sacrifice your family. Again, replicas, but better than nothing. And you could just imagine walking around your whole entire life with these daggers that one day will probably kill your mother. Here, also pass this around, but be very gentle. Typical daggers won't necessarily have symbols of protection, but they wanted to make sure that the body that they were sending with you was protected along with their soul. The tools that they used were also very particular. They just weren't using any type of tool to cremate your body. They made sure that each specific tool was created to take careful care of the body they were, burying basically with you. Murdering, in my opinion, but all to their own. Each organ would go into a specific jar, and it would stay there on the mantle with you in your tomb. These would be the tools that they use. They look similar to modern doctor tools, and we learned a thing or two from history finally. Here we have the cross, which they used as protection. Now, you would think that that cross looks very similar to the crosses that we have Jesus Christ on. Well, they all had to start at some point. There had to be a pinnacle for absolutely every religion. And most historians believe that because each Egyptian religion was the oldest, that it most likely started there. And because they shared with Greece and Rome their art and their knowledge, they also shared the idea of a cross. Although Greek and Romans used it as a torture method, everybody took their own interpretation. Here are some images depicting them again and how the jar should be set. And everybody's heard the mummies get their brains removed from their nose, so I included that as well. The government was actually extremely complicated, and there's not as much information in royal government for Egypt as one might think, because yes, they documented everything, but they also believed in destroying documents. The reason why they destroyed the documents was because they did not want anybody else to get an idea or go off and start their own little empire or start their own little kingdom. So for that, after every certain of years, they would just burn it or bury it along with the king so nobody else could get any more ideas. But the government was very strong because we were able to see that it was able to last many dynasties. So a dynasty is a family lineage. If there's 6 to your family, once 6 people pass away, then your dynasty is done. You'll go on to the next ruling. Marriage was very strange. Mothers could marry sons, sons could marry mothers, daughters and husbands could be brothers and sisters, cousins, and everything, and everybody was open, all because they wanted to keep the line of blood within the family. This led to inbreeding. The problem with inbreeding is you get deformities and knowledge actually goes down. The strongest rulers in the world's history are the ones that are farthest from the family tree, because the ones closest to the family tree happen to have the more birth defects, most of them mental. They could be slow of learning, and that could affect obviously an empire that you're trying to run, specifically some that are so deep and rich as ancient Egypt that has been around for centuries. Thank you. Here we have the powerful queens of ancient Egypt. They're powerful queens, regents, mothers, and one was king. One almost made it to king, but they killed her beforehand. They were like, we're not going to have another before ruin everything they did the last time. Here I have just a drawing. And if anybody can guess who she is, I would love to hear it after the end of this slide. These are the women that I'm writing about in my paper. They start again with Mernith in the Old Kingdom, and I included Hypatia because she was a strong ruler as well as regent, but not as strong as Cleopatra, so Hypatia is a loosely added one. The harems. So remember how I said that each pharaoh had a lot of children. Well, it wasn't just from one lady. Imagine a huge frat party, but no, a sorority party. And then the one frat guy comes in and everybody tries to sleep with the hunk, and then everybody ends up pregnant. And he goes, okay, well, I just want one kid out of every single one of you. To them, that didn't sound crazy, but to us, that sounds like bonkers. Why would you want to sleep with all these women? Again, because so many children passed away, they put the most attractive, the smartest, and knowledgeable young ladies in these harems. They were willingly, of course, because men and women had equal privileges in ancient Egypt. And they would adorn them with knowledge and food and anything they wanted in those harems. And then, every so often, the pharaoh would come to visit, impregnate as many women as he can, and then he just left. Absolutely just left out of there. Didn't even want to know their names. The beauty and fashion of ancient Egypt was something that Greece and Rome did not necessarily agree on, for the fact that both men and women were able to wear makeup. The eyeliner was meant as a protection to the sun because black absorbs the sun. So they thought we don't have sunglasses, so we're just going to put black under our eyes. So instead of it going into our eyeballs, it would go into the black eyeliner. So anybody was open to wear it. These are beauty boxes that both men and women could have. It had perfumes and it had anything that they needed to make themselves feel beautiful. Here we have a ring. This oval has a name, and it carries somebody's name in it, specifically somebody of high stature or a god or goddess. Here we have an example. Thank you to Professor Perrin for bringing his ring. Does anybody know who's on the image? She was dressed to look to the nine, one of the most attractive pharaohs that we're able to get from history, because Cleopatra was not a looker. Let me tell you, that woman was a little different. I wanted to give the example of how even in death it was influenced by the trade route, which was the Mediterranean, Greek, and Rome. We have here a typical sarcophagus. Now it's red. That meant that it's a woman's sarcophagus. It belonged to a woman who was supposed to be a man. But later and closer to the Ptolemaic period, we had them transition to closer to things that would look more Greek and Roman influenced. And you see this would be a tablet that would sit at the bottom or the bottom of one. And it has, again, a woman protecting it because they thought that women were all protectors of absolutely and everything. They wouldn't go to a man if they wanted advice. In ancient Egypt, they would go to a woman. In comparison to Greek and Rome, they would probably go to a man. Also, to show the juxtaposition of power in the Mediterranean, in Greece and Rome, if you happen to do something that the father or the head of the household, which is most likely a man, decided to be embarrassing, he could genocide the whole family, remarry, and start again. He can say, I was never married, never had kids. Who would know he's lying? As in ancient Egypt, if your neighbor found out that happened, you would most likely get executed or sent to jail because men, women, children of all genders, no matter what you liked, no matter who you wanted to sleep with, had equal power, both in politics and in marriage. This is jewelry that they would put on the queens that were the favorite of the kings, specifically concubines. But it wasn't necessarily something that the queens favored, because this gold is now going to a dead concubine and not you. And many women, as they would today, would not appreciate the mistress or the side person getting all the jewelry that they should have deserved. These are the tiles that they would put as well. They could have been requested, or they could have been just put because they didn't have any more images. The pharaohs had lots and lots and lots of things that they wanted to be buried with, specifically imagery, because they wanted to leave nothing left unturned for evil to attack them. So not only were there multiple layers in the sarcophagus, but they were solid as could be and made sure that nothing could get into them. They look almost like Russian nesting dolls. So here are two examples of them, and this is the bottom layer of what it would look like in one generation. And these are called nannies. They are meant also for protection, and there are thousands upon thousands of boxes of them in museums all around the world and still in Egypt because they were so paranoid about being taken in the afterlife. Here I have some tchotchkes that I took at the Museum of Metropolitan. And they're so tiny. So these images right here, these little figures, are smaller than my fingernail. And they are so intricately detailed. And it's not like something that they would just have and throw around. They were most likely somebody's mantles that they could just put up and have as decoration, or a child's toy if they wanted to as well. Here's some examples of the material that they used for cups and plates. And there's, again, thousands of them, and they are so minuscule. Here we have the comparison of women's bodies, because they did decide to feminize the woman's body, opposed to Asia at the same time decided to keep women with flat chests and to look as masculine as possible because they thought it was a sign of strength. But in Egypt, they thought bearing big, voluptuous breasts and hips and rear ends was beautiful. They thought not only for beauty of having a child, but also beauty of just being a gorgeous woman. She is specifically Isis, and you know that by the little column on the top of her head. And this is most likely a deity of fertility because of the hips. In this image, she's supposed to have a child on her lap, but she does not have it here, and she's holding one of her breasts. Now, what we can see here is that they're full, which means that she's most likely nursing a child. Where else in history do we see a mother with a child on its lap nursing a child? Well, in the church today, we see the Virgin Mary holding Jesus, also trying to feed him and giving him protection, as another example of religion being stolen specifically from the beginning of religion, which is Africa, Egypt, and the Middle East. Religion was vastly whitewashed, specifically in this time. Here are other images, and I couldn't keep them all in the PowerPoint, but if you guys would like to go through this binder, they also have more pictures of artifacts at the museum. Here we have women that clearly have wigs on, and these are the wigs. So Egyptians had straight black hair, which meant that it collected a lot of oils, and under the blazing heat, it's a cesspool for lice and anything and everything that can get into their hair. So what would they do? They would take beeswax and wax their whole entire body of hair, and most likely if it was royal families, their heads were deformed, so they look a little wonky, but they needed to cover it up, because you can't go out in public looking wonky. So what do? They went to the surrounding tribes, and because the surrounding tribes had thick hair, because they were darker skinned and they had the darker hair complexion, what they did is they shaved their hair off every once in a while, and instead of throwing it away, they donated it to the Egyptians, and in return, they would get money, which they could use for more trading and raising their empire, and the Egyptians got wigs. So wigs have been around for as long as anybody could ever believe. This is a replica of what the wigs would look like in its prime, and this is what the wigs look like now in just artifacts. They had a bag of weave. It was specifically labeled a bag of weave. So some woman or man was walking around in intentions to making a wig and possibly lost their satchel of hair. Anybody in today's age would be very mad, but if the wigs ended up looking like this and that bulky, I'm sure they weren't that sad about it at the end. Again, another woman wearing a wig. You could see it's a wig because it's tapered at the end and it's not that even, which meant that they most likely put some other materials in there, like other threads or gold or silver or whatever they could possibly get their hands on. This is another comparison of art through the years of Egypt. This would be closer to the end of the Ptolemaic period because it is influenced by Greece. And here we have something from the beginning of ancient Egypt where the totem is not only smaller, but it's made of a different material and has features closer to what we see in traditional statues from the beginning and middle kingdoms. Also to note is most of the nude figures bear proper anatomy. So they kept their pubic hair, but it wasn't their real pubic hair because remember, real hair back then, if they was straight under the heat, could catch lice or absolutely anything, especially in a society that allowed premarital sex. So they waxed it all off. And then what they did is not only make wigs for their head, but also make pubic wigs. Pretty gross, but that's what they liked. Here again, we have Isis with another goddess. And we could see from the horns here, this is Hathor. Hathor is the goddess of meat and cow. So essentially, the only meat that they had in surplus, specifically at the beginning of ancient Egypt, were cows. And they felt bad killing off their only source of meat. So they gave them a goddess because they were eating off the land, eating the meat, eating the cow, and they wanted to thank it for its nutrients. And therefore, they gave it a woman goddess because women give life in their eyes. And we know that in her woman figure, she has her horns with the little sun at the top. Here again, keeping proper anatomy. In today's age, if we're going to draw a woman, they try to make her to perfection. They try to avoid any creases or anything that people would deem like an imperfection. You know, we see it in social media, we see it on Instagram, but back then they thought it was beautiful. So here we have a woman that in today's age, you would say she's not as perfect because she has a couple rolls in her, but in their eyes, this was the pinnacle of beauty. My paper is called Exceptionally Unexceptional Women because they were seen to be the exceptional part of the Mediterranean at the time. This is the beginning of my paper. If you'd like to take a second to read it, you can. But for the most part, I believe this PowerPoint will be on Moodle. Leads us to Herodotus. Does anybody know who Herodotus is? Well, currently today we're learning history, and Herodotus is the father of history. We take the name history from his root name, and he wrote in this lengthy journal entry, which is very complex. He essentially wrote that the men sat down peeing and the women stood up peeing, basically castrating the men through literature that he knew others would read one day, because he wanted to make sure that other places did not get the idea of giving their women so much power that the Egyptians gave their women. And it wasn't any wrongdoing to his own because he was a free thinker, a philosopher. What made it interesting was that he was a product of his time. He studied more in Greece and in Rome and in other places that had toxic masculinity. Therefore, that's what his mindset was. So when he went to such a liberal area and a liberal empire, in his mind, he thought, wow, that's crazy. Women can actually work. And if you in today's lame terms, men who would see a guy doing everything his wife would call him whipped. Herodotus is saying in a more elegant way that the men were whipped. And that would conclude my presentations. If you guys have any questions for anything whatsoever, because this does end up popping up in other classes as well from what I've learned, feel free to contact me. This is my email. If not, that's fine, and I'll take any questions if you have any.
Any questions? Now's your chance.
Yes.
You were talking about, I forget exactly what it was, but you were saying that the women and children had like just as much like, I want to say like rights or something, or like the male thing. Were they like, like was there like an age limit on when like you can get married? Because I know like in some like religions and stuff, like the parents can force their child to get married at like 14. So like they can get married at a young age, but if they wanted to, could they get married at a young age?
If they wanted to, they could, but the ancient Egyptians did believe in maturity prior to marriage. Also because their dating was similar to how we date. It's if you want to date when you're a teenager, then that's fine. And if you're crazy and blindly in love and you want to get married at 16, they're like, so be it. If you want them, you want them. But they did believe also in education. So if you were a boy, you were given the option to extend your education farther than just the basic requirements. And if you were a woman, you could either take it or leave it, but for the most part, the men were more forced towards the education so that they could have more of the free thinking jobs. Although if a woman wanted to, she could also take one of the free thinking jobs. They never said no to that. Anybody else? Okay, thank you so much for giving me your time. It was a privilege. And again, if any questions, feel free to contact me.
This was fantastic.